He thought he was just getting married for the money, but a week after the wedding, he realized it was much more dangerous. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what country you're from. Sandra Becker's house stood at the edge of the industrial zone, where sidewalks ended in weeds and silence hung thick like exhaust on a windless day. The building was plain, rectangular, with tall, narrow windows and a heavy iron door that clicked shut like a vault. There was no lawn, no flowers, no sign of welcome, only a cracked concrete path leading to a place that felt like it belonged to no one but her. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. The hallway opened into a wide living space that resembled a gym more than a home. Barbells and dumbbells were stacked along the walls. Mirrors reflected a hulking power rack. The fridge in the adjoining kitchen held little more than boiled chicken, eggs, broccoli, and rows of protein containers. Everything was immaculate and rigid, a museum of self-discipline. Sandra stood before the wall-length mirror in the garage-turned weight room, her body gleaming with sweat under fluorescent lights. She lifted a 150-pound barbell with ease, her veins raised like ropes on her forearms. Her shoulders bulged with every repetition. At 39, she was still a monument of muscle and control. Her brown hair was pulled tightly into a braid. Her jaw was square and stern, her eyes sharp, always calculating, always watching for weakness, especially her own. The world knew her as Titan Sandra, a nickname coined during her championship reigns in international bodybuilding. She was the woman men called terrifying when they thought she couldn't hear. She had been on magazine covers, in commercials, even briefly on television. But when the trophy stopped and sponsors moved on, so did the cameras. Fame was a flame, short-lived, scorching, and then it vanished. Now she lived in solitude by design. People didn't know what to do with her. Too big to be feminine, too disciplined to be soft, too different to be desirable. She didn't miss the noise of public life, but sometimes in the quiet, a strange ache crept in, something she never named, but felt in her chest like a locked door with no key. She didn't expect to notice the boy. It happened at a local charity marathon where she'd been invited as a guest figurehead. She wasn't running. Her knees hated pavement, but she came out of habit to fulfill obligations. Between the speeches and the photographs, her ancient pickup truck refused to start. She stood over the open hood in the parking lot, arms crossed, fuming in silence. "Need help?" a voice asked, light but unsure. She turned. A young man in a faded hoodie and cheap sneakers stood a few feet away, one hand on the strap of his worn backpack. His brown hair was messy, his posture hesitant. He couldn't have been more than 20. Scrawny didn't cover it. He looked like he might get winded walking across the street. "I know a little about engines," he added quickly. "Not a mechanic or anything, just grew up fixing my mom's junker." Sandra studied him. Most people stared at her like she was part of a freak show or tried to impress her with bravado. This boy looked at her like she was human. She stepped aside and motioned toward the truck. He leaned in, muttering something about a loose connector. His hands moved with surprising confidence. 5 minutes later, the engine coughed to life. She raised an eyebrow. "Lucky guess," he said with a smile, wiping his hand on his jeans. Sandra held out a bottled water from her gym bag. He took it, their fingers brushing. His wrist was as thick as 2 of her fingers. She noticed how small his hand was against hers, but not in a mocking way, in a way that made her suddenly conscious of the space between them. "Thanks," he said. "My name's Evan." "Sandra," she replied simply. "Yeah," he chuckled. "I know." He didn't ask for a selfie. He didn't compliment her biceps. He just nodded politely and walked away, backpack slung over one shoulder, the sun catching on the frayed strap. That night, back in her silent home, Sandra found herself thinking about the encounter. She tried to ignore it, but the memory stuck, like the boy's voice, quiet and steady, cutting through the static of her usual days. Evan Miller was not the kind of young man people noticed. At school, he drifted between classes, always in the same hoodie, always on time, always quiet. He worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a bookstore, the other at an animal shelter. His home life was stretched thin, a sick mother who worked night shifts as a waitress, and a little sister who barely spoke since their father died. There were eviction notices on the fridge, overdue bills in every drawer, and no real hope of a scholarship. But Evan kept going. Not because he had a plan, he didn't, but because someone had to. He had given up on asking the world for anything. He survived by staying small, invisible, non-threatening. He did not expect to matter. And yet, Sandra remembered his name. Over the next few weeks, they saw each other again. By coincidence, or so Evan thought. Sandra donated equipment to the shelter. Evan happened to be on shift. She dropped off food at a community center. He was leading a kids' activity there. Each time their conversations grew a little longer, their silences a little more comfortable. She liked that he didn't treat her like a sideshow. He liked that she listened without interrupting. They didn't flirt. That would have been absurd. They just existed near each other with a strange and mutual ease. Then came the day that changed everything. Evan came home to find his mother in tears. Immigration had flagged her documents. Without legal status, her job was gone. Without income, their lease would be terminated. And with Evan over 18, his residency was now considered separate. In less than a month, they could all be homeless, or worse, deported. He tried everything: scholarships, loans, public aid. Every door slammed shut. He sat on the front steps of their crumbling building, head in his hands, wondering if disappearing would solve more problems than it caused. That's when Sandra appeared again. She didn't knock. She didn't call. She just walked up the steps, her shadow casting over him like a pillar of steel. "I heard about your situation," she said. Evan blinked up at her, confused and exhausted. "There's a way I can help," she added, "but it's not conventional." And then, without ceremony, without hesitation, she said the words that would turn both their lives upside down. "Marry me." For a second, Evan thought he misheard. His tired brain tried to make sense of her flat, unemotional tone. "I don't want anything from you," she continued. "I don't expect anything. It would be a legal arrangement. I can sponsor your residency. You'll be protected. Your family will be protected." He stared at her, speechless. "Why?" he finally asked, voice barely audible. Sandra shrugged. "Because I can. Because you don't deserve to be crushed by a system that doesn't care." It was absurd, insane, unreal. But as he looked into her eyes, steady, impassive, unblinking, he saw no deception, no manipulation, just truth, clear and raw. "I'm not afraid of what people will say," she said. "Are you?" The silence between them stretched, charged with something neither of them could name. And then, slowly, Evan nodded. The decision sent shockwaves through both their worlds. Evan's mother screamed, begged, accused. His professors pulled him aside with questions thinly veiled as concern. Online, strangers spat venom through keyboards, memes, insults, speculation. Some called Sandra a predator, others called Evan a coward. He ignored them, or tried to, but the words stuck to him like oil, seeping into his skin. They said he was weak, that he'd sold himself, that he'd never be a real man. And yet, on the day of their marriage, when Sandra walked into the courthouse in a simple black dress with no makeup and her hair in a tight braid, Evan looked at her and felt safe. She signed the papers without flinching. He followed suit. No kiss, no rings. Just 2 signatures and the thud of a stamp. When they walked out, cameras waited. Shouts rang out. Flashes popped. Sandra stepped in front of Evan, shielding him with her massive frame. The crowd jeered. She didn't blink. That night, in the silence of her home, Evan stood in the hallway with his duffel bag. Sandra pointed to a guest room. He nodded and went inside without a word. She returned to the garage and began lifting again, each repetition slower than usual, her muscles shaking in a way they hadn't for years. In different rooms surrounded by silence, 2 people who had never fit in anywhere lay awake. One on a mattress too hard, the other on a bench press, both wondering what they had just done. Neither knew that this strange, quiet arrangement would become the most honest connection either had ever known. And neither could imagine how much they would need each other before it was over. The first morning in Sandra's house began in silence. Evan woke to the sound of nothing. No clatter of dishes, no murmurs from his sister's cartoons, no scrape of his mother's tired feet across their sagging floorboards, just the low hum of a refrigerator somewhere far off, and the echo of his own breathing in a room too large and too bare to feel real. The bed was firm, almost aggressively so, with pristine sheets tucked tighter than any he'd known. There were no posters, no family photos, no scattered books or socks. Just a wardrobe that smelled of cedar and a single window that overlooked nothing but concrete and steel fencing. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes and blinking into the pale gray light. His duffel bag sat by the door where he had left it, untouched. He hadn't unpacked. It had felt too temporary. Still did. He wandered into the kitchen sometime after 7, wearing a clean t-shirt and the same jeans he had worn to the courthouse. Sandra was already there, standing at the counter in a tank top and gym shorts, slicing boiled chicken into perfect cubes with the focus of a surgeon. Her biceps flexed with every movement. Her back, broad and knotted with muscle, seemed immovable. "Morning," he said cautiously. She didn't look up. "There's oatmeal in the pot." He moved towards the stove. It wasn't instant oatmeal. It wasn't sweet. There was no milk, no sugar, no fruit, just oats and water and maybe a pinch of salt. Still, he spooned some into a bowl and sat down at the far end of the counter, unsure whether he was supposed to eat with her or not. Sandra finished her prep, packed the chicken into a set of identical glass containers, then finally turned to face him. Her gaze was unreadable, sharp as a chisel, but not unkind. "Do you have class today?" "No, I have online lectures, and I'm off work." "Good," she said. "We have paperwork to start, immigration, residency status. You'll need a new ID." He nodded, forcing down a bite of the bland oatmeal. It stuck to his mouth like paste. "Also," she added, pouring herself a glass of water, "people will ask questions. We need to get our story straight." Evan glanced up, a trace of nervous humor in his eyes. "You mean our love story?" Sandra didn't smile. "I mean the facts, how we met, what you know about me, what I know about you. Dates, habits, details. It has to be tight." He swallowed. "Right, of course." She downed the water in one gulp, her throat working like a piston, then set the glass down with a gentle but final thud. "I'll write a basic timeline. You fill in your part. We'll rehearse later." Then she left the room. The day blurred into forms and scans and signatures. Sandra sat beside him at the kitchen table with a stack of documents neatly organized in labeled folders. She knew the process cold. He just followed her lead, initialing where she pointed, murmuring "okay" and "got it" as she walked him through the bureaucratic labyrinth. Once, he paused over a section that asked about romantic history. His pen hovered. "Do I lie?" "You simplify," she said without hesitation. "One ex, nothing serious. Dated in school, mutual pardon, no hard feelings." He nodded. By nightfall, Evan felt like he had aged 10 years. His head hurt from the constant calculations. What year did they meet? What movie did they watch on their third date? What was her favorite food? He hadn't realized how intimate lies had to be. The next day brought the storm. Someone had taken a photo outside the courthouse. It showed Evan, small and pale in his collared shirt, standing beside Sandra's hulking frame. She wasn't smiling. She rarely did. Her eyes looked forward, focused, while his looked off to the side, caught mid-blink, like a child lost in a crowd. The caption beneath the viral post read, "Boy marries She-Hulk, love or leverage?" Comments flooded in like sewage. "She's grooming him. How much do you think she paid?" This is why testosterone matters. "Kid, blink twice if you need help." There were jokes, memes, a side-by-side of Beauty and the Beast, except the Beast was female. Sandra saw it before Evan did. She didn't show him. She simply turned off her phone, set it face down, and went to train. Evan found out later when a classmate sent him the link. He stared at the screen for a long time, not because he didn't expect it, but because he did, and it still stung. He closed the browser, muted the group chat, and sat on the edge of his bed until his fingers stopped shaking. That evening, he entered the gym room downstairs. Sandra was bench pressing enough weight to crush a car. Sweat poured down her arms. Her breath came in low, focused bursts. He stood there a moment, unsure whether to interrupt. "Do you need something?" she asked without turning her head. He hesitated. "I saw the posts." "Don't read them," she said. Her voice was steady, but something about her grip on the bar changed. Firmer, tighter. "It's hard not to." She set the bar back on its hooks, sat up, and wiped her face with a towel. Then she looked at him, not past him, not around him, at him. "Do you regret it?" He blinked. "No, I just didn't expect people to be so cruel." "You should have." He nodded. She was right. "But," he said after a pause, "they don't know you." Sandra's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in confusion. "They don't know how methodical you are," he continued, "how you color-code everything, how you measure oatmeal by the gram, how you always double-check dates and carry a second pair of shoes in the trunk just in case." A flicker passed across her face, something unreadable. Then it was gone. "I'm just saying," he finished quietly, "if they're gonna lie, we might as well make ours better." Sandra stood, her full height dwarfed him. She didn't touch him, she never did, but there was a stillness to her presence now that hadn't been there before, a kind of awareness. "We rehearse tomorrow," she said. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt almost like choreography. They practiced answers. They walked through fake anniversaries and coffee orders. Sandra learned that Evan was allergic to cinnamon. Evan learned that Sandra had broken her first bone in a playground fight defending a girl from a bully. It was small things, mundane things, but they built something between them, an invisible thread of shared memory, even if imagined. Sandra never softened. She didn't laugh at his jokes. She didn't ask about his past. But she listened. That alone made Evan feel seen. Then came the unexpected dinner invitation. A local nonprofit Sandra had previously supported invited her and her new husband to a fundraiser. It was a formal affair. business casual, assigned seating, photos for the donors. She told Evan he didn't have to come. "I'll go," he said. The hall was glossy, full of suits and dresses and careful smiles. When Sandra entered, every head turned. Her body was wrapped in a tailored navy suit, custom-made to fit her frame. She looked like a gladiator at a wedding. Evan walked beside her in a too-loose blazer, trying not to trip over his words or feet. At one point, a patron leaned over and whispered to Evan, "Blink twice if she's holding you hostage." He smiled politely. "I'm good, thanks." Later in the evening, a woman in a gold gown approached with a microphone. "We've heard so much about your whirlwind romance," she beamed. "Would you do us the honor of opening the dance floor?" Evan froze. Sandra's expression didn't change, but her jaw shifted slightly, tightened. "We don't," he began, but the crowd had already cleared a space. She looked at him. "Can you dance?" "Not well." "Neither can I." She stepped forward and offered her hand. He took it. The music was slow, syrupy, some classic jazz piece Evan didn't recognize. She moved carefully, deliberately, as if afraid of crushing him. His hands barely reached her shoulders. Her fingers engulfed his. But they moved. The silence in the room was louder than the music. Phones rose, flashes popped. Evan looked up once and saw the room watching them with that same blend of amusement and disbelief that had followed them since day one. But Sandra didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on him, calm, unwavering. And for that one song, he didn't care what anyone thought. Afterward, the video appeared online. Again, it went viral. Again, the comments came, some mocking, some cruel, but some, just a few, were different. "That kid's brave. She looks like she'd destroy anyone who hurts him. Kind of sweet, actually. Weirdest couple ever, but I'm rooting for them." They didn't talk about the video. Not that night, but Sandra trained harder the next morning. And Evan left a bowl of strawberries on the table, something she'd once mentioned liking as a child. It wasn't romance, it wasn't love, but it was something. And in a world that didn't know what to make of either of them, something was enough for now. The video of their dance continued to circulate online, gathering views like falling snow. At first, Evan tried to avoid the attention altogether. He closed his social media, ignored his text, stopped replying to classmates who messaged with emojis and half-baked jokes. But even in silence, the noise found him. He overheard two students at the bus stop whispering about the bodybuilder bride and her boy toy husband. One of them laughed too loudly, then glanced at him and quickly looked away. The whispers didn't stop when he entered Sandra's home each evening. They followed him in his own thoughts, clinging like static. But the house itself, as always, was immaculately still. Sandra's world didn't hum with chaos the way his used to. It was measured, sterile, purposeful, a place built to contain intensity, not invite it. And now he was inside of it, living among her polished surfaces and iron routines like a guest in a foreign land. The guest room was the cleanest space he had ever known. It bore no sign of the person who had once slept there. Sandra had prepared it for him, he knew, but it felt like a temporary station, not a home. His duffel bag still sat in the corner, half-zipped, clothes folded too neatly to be natural. He hadn't yet put anything on the shelves. He didn't want to disturb the strange balance of the room. At first, he thought he'd get used to the silence. He welcomed it, in fact. After a lifetime of small apartments echoing with the cries of his sister and the creak of his mother's late-night pacing, the stillness seemed almost luxurious. but it wore on him slowly, like water smoothing stone. He missed noise, not the shouting or chaos, but the life it represented. A door slamming, a laugh from the hallway, the scrape of a chair. Sandra moved through her house like a shadow. Her presence was constant, yet distant. She woke before dawn, trained for 2 hours, ate in silence, and vanished into her own space. When she worked, she did so with military precision. Every protein container labeled. Every training schedule printed and pinned. Her day was a list of boxes she checked with the same silent discipline as a soldier. Evan had never seen anyone operate with such relentless order, but that order left no room for softness. He attempted to breach the walls in small ways. He started leaving little notes on the fridge. Harmless, funny, observational. "Do eggs get tired of being perfect?" he wrote once. Another time, "Broccoli again. What did cauliflower ever do to you?" She never commented, but the notes didn't disappear. He took that as a good sign. One evening, while Sandra was out for a run, Evan wandered the house more freely than usual. He had grown used to staying out of her way, navigating the space like a respectful tenant, not a husband. But that night, curiosity pulled him down the hallway toward a door that had always remained closed. It wasn't locked. He opened it gently and stepped inside what he quickly realized was a storage room, though not of the usual kind. There were shelves lined with old trophies, some gleaming, some dusty. Framed photographs leaned against the walls, not hung. A few medals rested in a velvet-lined case, but what caught his eye was the box on the table. Inside were pictures. Not professional shots or competition images, but candid ones. A teenage girl with a wide, almost goofy grin, standing barefoot on a beach. A young woman in oversized glasses strumming a guitar beside a bonfire. A notebook filled with music chords and half-finished lyrics. One page had the words, "I want to feel small just once," scribbled in the margin. Evan's heart ached. He was so engrossed that he didn't hear her footsteps until it was too late. He turned around quickly, guilt flaring in his chest. Sandra stood in the doorway, damp with sweat, a towel slung over one shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, but not surprised. "You found the museum," she said dryly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to snoop." She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the photos but never meeting his. "You're the first person to ever see that room." He hesitated, unsure of what to say. "You played music?" "Once." "What happened?" She crossed her arms. "The same thing that always happens. I got too big, too loud, too serious. People stop inviting you to sit around the fire when your arms are thicker than their legs." Evan looked at the picture again. "You looked happy." "I was pretending to be someone I wasn't." There was a pause. He didn't fill it. Sandra finally looked at him. "I keep it because, I don't know, maybe to remind myself I didn't start out this way." He nodded. "We never do." That night, for the first time since moving in, Evan cooked dinner. Real dinner. Nothing boiled. He made pasta with garlic, roasted vegetables, and soft bread with butter. He placed it on the table without ceremony and waited, unsure if she would even try it. Sandra entered the kitchen 15 minutes later, still damp from her shower, dressed in clean workout clothes. She paused at the table. "You made all this?" "Yeah." She sat without a word, took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "It's good," she said. Evan blinked. "Really?" "Don't get cocky." He smiled. They ate in silence. But it was different this time. Not empty, not cold, just quiet in a way that allowed air to move between them. After dinner, Sandra lingered for a moment. "Thanks," she said before heading back to her room. He lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, wondering what walls were still left between them, and which ones had started to crack. The next day, he heard her training in the basement early in the morning. The sounds were familiar now, the clank of weights, the deep breaths, the occasional low grunt. But this time, there was something different in the rhythm. It wasn't just exertion. It sounded like fury. Concern tugged at him. He padded down the stairs and paused outside the gym. Through the glass panel in the door, he saw her throwing punches into a heavy bag. Her movements were brutal, sharp, fast, relentless. Her shoulders trembled with each strike, not from weakness, but from something deeper. He opened the door quietly. She didn't stop. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. She threw one last punch, then turned and grabbed a towel. "Fine." "You don't seem fine." She tossed the towel onto the bench and sat, elbows on knees, head down. They posted another article. Evan sat across from her. "About us? About me? About you? About the freak show?" She made air quotes, her hands trembling slightly. He stayed quiet. "They called you a victim, said I'm manipulating you, that I bought you. You didn't." "I know that," she snapped, "but they don't." "Then forget them." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "It's not that simple." "I know it's not," he said gently, "but it's also not what matters." She scoffed. Evan stood, walked to the weight rack, lifted a small dumbbell, too small for her to even bother with. He turned and held it out. "What's this?" she asked. "Proof I'm still weak," he said with a small grin, "and that I still get to choose who makes me feel safe." Sandra stared at him. Slowly, she reached out and took the dumbbell from his hand. Their fingers touched. That night, she didn't train. She watched a movie with him instead. She didn't laugh at the jokes, but she stayed until the credits rolled. Progress, he thought, real progress. It wasn't fast, it wasn't romantic, but it was real. And for two people who had built their lives behind walls, that meant more than anything. The movie ended, but they didn't move. Sandra sat rigid on the couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, while Evan remained still beside her, hands folded in his lap. The credits rolled, casting soft blue light over the darkened room. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the windows. The air in the living room had grown dense, not from awkwardness but from something closer to waiting, like the space between inhaling and exhaling. It wasn't until the music faded that Sandra stirred. She rose without a word, carried her empty glass to the kitchen, and returned moments later with 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Evan, her fingers brushing his as he accepted it. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd expected. They sat in silence, sipping slowly, letting the warmth of the mugs replace the heat neither of them knew how to ask for. The night passed like that, 2 people suspended in a fragile truce, tethered by shared stillness. The following morning began as most did. Sandra was already in the gym by dawn, the sound of weights echoing through the house. Evan made oatmeal, left a banana on the counter for her, and opened his laptop to begin the day's assignments. He had grown used to the rhythm of life in the Becker house, its silence, its steel, its hidden currents. He had stopped trying to shape it and started learning to read it instead. But that rhythm was broken mid-morning when Sandra appeared in the hallway holding her phone. "They want to schedule an interview," she said, her voice even but tight. Evan looked up. "Immigration?" Sandra nodded. He closed the laptop slowly. "When?" "Next week. In person. They want us both there." Evan swallowed. "Okay. We need to prepare." Of course they did. And yet, despite the weeks they had already spent crafting their story, rehearsing details, memorizing timelines and dates, something about this request felt heavier, realer. They would no longer be words on paper or names on forms. They would be people in a room, under scrutiny, watched for every flicker of doubt or hesitation. Sandra began preparing that same afternoon with the same focus she brought to everything else. She reviewed their file, cross-referenced answers, quizzed Evan in the kitchen like a drill sergeant with a clipboard. What's my favorite movie? Heat. What's my favorite protein? Turkey. What's my bedtime? 11, but you usually stay up. She paused. Doing what? Training, or sitting in the dark thinking. She raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. I hear the floors creak. He wasn't wrong. Despite the mechanical nature of their practice, something began to shift. They weren't just rehearsing facts. They were shaping something that, while artificial in origin, was becoming strangely real in texture. Evan began to speak about her with confidence. Sandra corrected him less. Their answers began to align without prompting. Still, there were gaps, unspoken truths, moments that couldn't be practiced or memorized. The day before the interview, Sandra stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, adjusting the collar of her blazer. It was deep gray, expertly tailored to frame her formidable figure without making her look like a wall of granite. She looked over at Evan, who stood behind her, watching her reflection with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. You okay? He asked. I don't like being judged. Evan nodded. You're not alone in that. Their ride to the immigration office was silent. Sandra drove, her hand steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road. Evan sat beside her, suit jacket too tight across the shoulders, fingers tapping anxiously on his knee. Neither spoke until they reached the building. Inside, the waiting room was bright and sterile. Couples sat in plastic chairs, clutching folders and murmuring quietly. Some held hands. Others stared at the floor. Sandra and Evan took seats near the wall. She didn't reach for him, but her arm rested near his, close enough that their sleeves touched. A clerk called their names, and they were led into a small office where a stern woman with glasses motioned for them to sit. For the record, she began, I'm here to verify the authenticity of your marital relationship. I'm not here to judge your choices. I only ask for honesty. Sandra nodded. Evan tried not to squirm. The questions began. How did you meet? What was your first date? What side of the bed do you sleep on? Who cooks more often? Have you met each other's families? Some answers flowed easily. Others caught in their throats. When the woman asked Evan what Sandra liked for breakfast, he paused. She doesn't eat breakfast most days, he said, just coffee and boiled water. But when she does, it's always oats, no sugar, with 6 almonds, not 5, not 7. Sandra looked at him. The woman raised her eyebrows. That's oddly specific. It's true, Sandra confirmed. After an hour, the interview concluded. The woman made no indication of how she felt about their performance. She simply thanked them, informed them that they would receive notice by mail, and dismissed them. Outside, the sky had darkened. Rain threatened on the horizon. Sandra exhaled, not loudly, but deeply. You were good, she said as they reached the car. Evan smiled faintly. So were you. That evening, they sat in the living room again, but this time without the pretense of distraction. The television remained off. Sandra stretched her legs out on the floor, foam rolling her calves. Evan sat on the couch with a book open in his lap, unread. Do you think they believed us? He asked after a while. I think they saw what they needed to. But is that enough? Sandra paused mid-roll. You tell me." He looked at her. "I don't know anymore. Sometimes I forget what's real and what's part of the story." She sat back against the wall, her chest rising and falling slowly. "It's both." Evan tilted his head. "We built the lie to survive," she said, "but that doesn't mean everything inside it is false." He considered that. Then he asked the question that had been burning in the back of his mind since the night they danced. "Why me?" Sandra's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. A softness, perhaps, or maybe the absence of her usual iron. "Because you looked at me," she said, "not around me, not through me, at me. That's all. For someone like me," she said, "that's everything." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was weighty, full, like a room that had finally been furnished after years of echo. The next morning, Evan found her in the backyard, barefoot on the patio, breathing deeply as she moved through slow, deliberate stretches. The sunrise cast a golden sheen over her muscles. She looked less like a warrior and more like a sculpture. Still, silent, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with mass. He didn't interrupt. Later, she joined him in the kitchen and pointed to a flyer that had arrived in the mail. A charity gala, the same organization they had supported before, had invited them again, this time as guests of honor. A public appearance, a speech, cameras. "You can say no," she said. Evan shook his head. "Let's go." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. The night of the gala, Sandra wore a black gown that hugged her shoulders and left her arms bare. Her hair, usually in a braid, was tied up. Evan wore a charcoal suit with sleeves slightly too short. They arrived together, cameras flashing, people staring. During the dinner, a speaker welcomed them and thanked Sandra for her continued support. Then came the moment she had dreaded. "Would you say a few words?" Sandra stood slowly, her expression composed but unreadable. She walked to the microphone, adjusted it down to her height, and paused. Her voice, when it came, was firm and low. "I'm not good at speeches," she said, "but I'm good at surviving." She glanced toward Evan. "When you live your life as something the world doesn't understand, you get used to walls. You build them. You live behind them. And sometimes someone comes along and doesn't try to tear them down. They just sit beside you on the other side." The room was silent. "I didn't get married because I was lonely or desperate. I did it because someone looked at me and didn't flinch. Maybe that's all any of us want. To be seen, to be held, not with hands, but with space." She stepped back. People clapped. Some stood. Others sat quietly, watching. Evan met her near the stairs. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They walked out into the night together, no longer performing, no longer pretending. And for the first time, Evan realized he wasn't acting anymore. Neither of them were. The next few days passed in a kind of suspended quiet, a gentler echo of everything that had come before. The gala had left a ripple between them, subtle but undeniable. There was less tension in Sandra's shoulders when she entered a room now. Evan didn't hesitate before speaking, or walking near her, or sitting close enough for their sleeves to brush. It was a slow unraveling of old distance. No declarations, no sudden shifts, just the cautious, steady thawing of something frozen for too long. Still, there were walls. Evan began to sense them in the way Sandra retreated when conversation drifted too near her past. In the sharp way her gaze dropped when compliments came her way, or in the way her body tensed whenever someone touched on the word feminine. She could bear the weight of the world with ease, but softness, true, raw vulnerability, was a different burden entirely. He didn't press, he waited. It was a Wednesday when the silence finally cracked. The morning had started normally. Sandra had finished her first round of training by 6, showered, and settled at the kitchen table to review a training schedule for a young athlete she had recently agreed to mentor. Evan had woken later, bleary-eyed, hair sticking up, wearing a t-shirt 2 sizes too large. He moved with the easy sluggishness of someone who trusted the house to greet him gently. Sandra made him coffee without asking. That, in itself, was new. They ate in companionable silence. She glanced up once, noticed him reading a news article about a local high school athlete being suspended for steroid use, and muttered, "Happens every year. They think shortcuts will save them from pain." "You ever get accused?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I got accused before I ever touched a weight." Evan looked up. She stared into her coffee, her expression unreadable. "I was 12, she said, already taller than most boys. My shoulders were broader than the gym teachers. I didn't even know what steroids were. But the whispers started early. Freak, giant, gorilla." He swallowed. "What did your parents do?" "My mother told me to keep my head down. My father stopped coming to my games, said he couldn't handle watching his daughter turn into a man." Evan's heart twisted. "I'm sorry." Sandra shrugged, but it wasn't dismissive. It was the kind of shrug that people use when the weight they carry has long since fused with their bones. "That's when I found the gym," she continued, "at 14. I was angry all the time. Couldn't control it, couldn't talk about it, but I could lift." He said nothing. She didn't need interruption. "I liked the pain," she said, "the burn, the solitude. Nobody asked me questions in the weight room. Nobody tried to fix me. I didn't have to smile or flirt or be cute. I could just work." Evan watched her closely. Her voice had lost its usual precision. It was rougher now, quieter, full of edges she didn't bother to polish. "I thought if I became strong enough, no one would ever hurt me again. Not with words, not with hands." "You did," he said softly. "You became stronger than anyone." Sandra looked up, her eyes sharp. "But strength," he continued, "doesn't protect you from being alone." Her mouth opened, closed. She looked away. Later that day, she disappeared into the basement gym and didn't come out until the sun had begun to set. Evan knew better than to follow. Instead, he cooked again, something warm with spices. He lit a candle on the table, not for romance, but for the sake of softness. A small act of offering. She joined him around 8, said nothing about the food or the candle. But she sat. She ate. And when he refilled her glass, she murmured a quiet thank you. That night, around midnight, Evan woke to the sound of muffled impact. He padded into the hallway, barefoot, heart thudding. The noise came again, from the basement. He descended the stairs slowly, unsure of what he'd find. The door to the gym was ajar. Through it, he saw Sandra, barefoot, wearing only a sports bra and shorts, striking a hanging bag with vicious, rapid blows. Her hair was damp with sweat clinging to her face. Her shoulders gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Each punch came with a low grunt, breathless and tight. He didn't speak, just watched. After a few minutes, her pace slowed. She turned toward a rack of dumbbells and then, slowly, to him. "You shouldn't be up," she said. "I heard something." She looked down. Her hands trembled. Her knuckles were raw. He stepped inside. She didn't stop him. "You ever feel like your body betrayed you?" she asked suddenly. "Like it became something you never asked for, but now you're trapped in it forever?" Evan hesitated. "Yes," he said, "but maybe not in the same way." Sandra sat on the bench. Her breath was still heavy. I spent my whole life building this body brick by brick, rep by rep, and now I don't know what I built it for. Evan moved closer. To protect yourself. And what if I don't want to fight anymore? He sat beside her. Then maybe it's time to let someone else protect you. She looked at him, really looked. Then, slowly, her shoulders began to shake, not from effort, but from something deeper. She bowed her head, hiding her face behind calloused hands. Evan didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He simply sat, letting her unravel without interruption. When the tears stopped, she wiped her face with the edge of her towel and muttered, "You're not supposed to see that." "Too late." She gave a short, broken laugh. "You really don't run, do you?" "No," he said, "not from you." They sat in silence again. This time it wasn't heavy. It was open. She broke it. "I had a photo shoot once, right after I won my last title. They oiled me up, put me in a gold bikini, made me pose like a sex doll with biceps. The photographer called me exotic. Said I looked like a weapon." Evan grimaced. "Sounds awful." "I didn't even see the photos until months later. My body didn't look like mine. Just armor." He touched her wrist gently. "You're not a weapon." "No," she said. "I'm just tired of being treated like one." They returned upstairs around 2 in the morning. Evan offered to make tea. Sandra accepted. They drank it, standing at the kitchen counter, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion, comfortable in the quiet. Before bed, she said, "Thank you for listening." He nodded. "Anytime." The following days settled into something new, not softer, exactly, but more honest. Sandra didn't retreat as much. She let him see her without makeup, let him play music while she trained, let him enter the gym when she lifted, provided he stayed quiet and didn't hover. Evan started leaving her small notes again. This time, she answered. Once, he wrote on a sticky note, "Do muscles dream of naps?" She replied, "Only when Evan makes decent coffee." They were still strange, still awkward, but slowly they were becoming a pair. Not in the romantic sense, perhaps, not yet, but in the way vines and stones sometimes grow around one another until neither can be moved without the other cracking. One afternoon, Evan returned from class to find Sandra sitting at the kitchen table, looking at an old photograph. He recognized it as one from the storage room, a younger version of her, smiling with a guitar slung across her shoulder. "I used to sing," she said without looking up. "Not well, but loud." "You should sing again." She snorted. "You first." He shrugged. "Only in the shower, and only when no one's home." She looked at him. "You sing in my house?" He grinned. "Just once, maybe twice." That night, she brought him a pair of wireless headphones. "So, you don't have to wait until I leave." He smiled. "That's weirdly thoughtful." She tilted her head. "I'm weirdly thoughtful." Later, when he put them on, he found a playlist already queued up. It was titled Loud, Not Pretty. Every song was about strength, and every voice, female. He didn't say anything the next morning, just handed her a sticky note. "Best playlist I've ever heard." She didn't respond, but her smile stayed with him all day. And for the first time he began to wonder if strength, true strength, wasn't something that lived in muscle or silence. Maybe it lived in being seen and choosing not to hide. It began with a photograph, one neither of them had posed for. Sandra had been adjusting the weight plates on the squat rack outside a small community gym where she volunteered twice a month. Evan stood nearby, sipping coffee from a paper cup, one arm slung across his chest as if to guard against the chill. His expression was relaxed, maybe even faintly amused. Sandra's head was turned toward him, lips parted mid-word, one hand on the barbell. In that moment, something unspoken had passed between them. Familiarity, comfort, perhaps even affection. The image was captured by a reporter for a local human interest blog doing a piece on body positivity and public fitness programs. The article was benign, even complimentary, but the photo, casual, unscripted, told a story far more complicated than the writer ever intended. Within 48 hours, it was everywhere. The caption that went viral was not from the article, but from a tweet. She could bench him and break him, and yet look at his face. The comments followed. Some were playful, some cruel, some awestruck, some revolted. This is what modern marriage looks like now? Good for them. Confidence is sexy on both sides. I'd give anything for a woman like that to look at me like that. He's clearly just there for the visa. They didn't see it at first. Sandra didn't bother with social media. Evan had deactivated most of his accounts after the courthouse incident. But the internet had a way of reaching you, even when you tried to shut the door. It was Evan's classmate who brought it up during a break between lectures. "Dude, is that really you?" he asked, holding out his phone, the image bright on the screen. Evan's stomach twisted. "Yeah," he said slowly, "that's us." The classmate stared a moment longer, then muttered, "No judgment, man, just unexpected." He smiled tightly and returned to his notes, but the chill had already set in. Later, at the bookstore where Evan worked weekends, a middle-aged man buying a self-help book for men's leadership smirked at him. "You the boy who married the bodybuilder?" Evan didn't answer. The man chuckled and dropped a 20 on the counter. "You must have a spine under there somewhere." By the time he got home that evening, Evan was vibrating with a mix of humiliation and rage. But when he walked through the front door, Sandra was already waiting at the kitchen table, the laptop open in front of her. Her jaw was tight, her arms folded across her chest like a fortress. "You've seen it?" he asked. She nodded. "Are you mad?" "No," she said, "just tired." Evan pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. For a moment, they said nothing. The screen still displayed the photo, clean, quiet, and real, in a way no posed image could ever be. And yet, stripped of context, it had become a symbol neither of them had agreed to create. "They think I'm weak," Evan said finally, his voice low, "because I'm not. You." Sandra looked at him. "They think I'm unnatural because I am." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" she asked, not with bitterness, but with exhaustion. "To them, I'm a contradiction. I don't smile the way I should. I don't walk like I'm supposed to. I don't wear the right clothes or hold my tongue. I've spent my whole life building strength, and it still gets boiled down to a punchline." Evan stared at the image. "And what does that make me?" She leaned forward, her eyes hard. "You're the one who stayed." That stopped him. In the days that followed, more messages came in. A journalist reached out requesting an interview. A podcast on unconventional relationships sent an invite. A reality show hinted at a feature segment. Sandra declined them all. "They don't want to hear our story," she said. "They want to shape it." But the noise didn't die down. Someone leaked their names. Public records were pulled. Old competition photos of Sandra resurfaced, side by side with candid snapshots of Evan entering or leaving the house. The fascination wasn't malicious exactly. It was worse. It was indifferent. They were being consumed as curiosity. One afternoon, a reporter actually came to their front door. Sandra opened it herself, wearing a hoodie and gym shorts. She filled the doorway like a gate. The reporter, A woman in a blazer with oversized sunglasses barely reached her collarbone. "I just want a quote," she said, not even pretending to be subtle. "You've become something of a symbol." "No," Sandra said flatly, "but people are inspired." "No." The reporter didn't move. Sandra stepped forward, just one step. The woman flinched and backed away. The door closed without a slam, but the message was louder than any shout. That night, Evan cooked dinner again. Sandra didn't train. Instead, they ate together in silence. The television played a documentary on mute in the background. It was about migration, survival, resilience. After dinner, Evan sat on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with his fingers. "They don't see what I see," he said. Sandra looked up from her mug. "What do you see?" "I see someone who never asked to be admired, someone who never demanded applause, someone who built herself piece by piece because no one else ever helped carry the weight." He paused. "And I see someone who still thinks that makes her hard to love." Her breath caught, just a little. "And?" she asked. "And I'm still here." They didn't touch. They didn't cry. But Sandra looked at him then, really looked, and something behind her eyes shifted, not in surrender, but in recognition. The next day, Evan received a message from his younger sister. "Saw the photo. You looked okay, happy even." He replied simply, "I am." By week's end, the attention began to shift, as it always did. The internet moved on. A celebrity scandal, a political debate, another viral clip. Their moment in the spotlight faded, but something between them remained illuminated. Sandra returned to training. Evan returned to class. But the silence between them no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like choice. One morning, Sandra found a letter on the kitchen table. A handwritten note from a girl named Renee in Wisconsin. It said, "I saw your photo. I'm 15. I have arms like yours and everyone at school laughs. Thank you for not hiding." Sandra didn't respond to it, but she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beneath her training journal. Evan noticed. He said nothing. But that night, before sleep, Sandra knocked once on the frame of his bedroom door. "Hey," she said, "yeah? Would you want to come for a walk tomorrow?" He blinked. "You mean, like, outside?" "No," she said dryly. "On the treadmill. Yes, outside." He smiled. "Sure." She nodded once and turned away. But before the door closed, she added, "Thank you for being seen with me, even when it was hard." Evan watched the empty doorway for a long time after. He didn't sleep much, but in the early hours of morning, just before the sun broke the horizon, he smiled. Not because the world had stopped looking, but because they had stopped needing it to understand. The morning after the interview storm passed and the attention drifted away, the world around them seemed to breathe a little softer. There were no reporters at the door, no strangers lingering by the sidewalk with their phones raised like weapons. The internet had turned its appetite elsewhere, leaving Sandra and Evan in the hush that followed the roar. It was in that silence, finally, that they began to settle. Not as storybook characters or symbols, but as two people who had built something real from something that began as a necessary lie. Their walk the next morning was quiet. Sandra led the way down the gravel path behind the industrial park near their neighborhood, where no one went unless they had a reason to be forgotten. The wind tugged gently at the hem of her jacket. She wore no makeup, no sunglasses, no facade. Evan kept pace beside her, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. He had grown comfortable in her silence, not because it offered nothing, but because it no longer hid anything. They didn't talk until they reached the edge of the overgrown lot where a rusted-out basketball hoop leaned against a crumbling brick wall. Evan stopped, towing a piece of broken concrete. "I used to play here," he said, "when I was a kid, before they tore down the school and put up storage units." Sandra looked around. "Doesn't look like much now." "It didn't look like much then either," he said with a half smile, "but it was ours." They stood together in the brittle morning light, the smell of dust and frost in the air. The wind pressed low against the weeds, bending them without breaking them. Sandra finally turned to him. "You've changed." Evan tilted his head. "Since when?" "Since the day we met. Since the day you fixed my truck and didn't ask for anything." He chuckled. "I didn't know what I was getting into." "Neither did I." They made their way back slowly. No one bothered them. No cameras flashed. And for the first time since they had walked out of the courthouse months ago, they felt something close to normalcy, or at least their own version of it. The weeks that followed carried a kind of quiet rhythm, not unlike music that hummed below the threshold of speech. Sandra continued training, but now she let Evan stay in the gym with her sometimes. He sat in the corner with his laptop, working on essays or reading quietly, the clank of metal soothing rather than disruptive. Occasionally, he would glance up and find her watching him between sets. She never said anything, but he always smiled back. At night, they cooked together more often. Sometimes it was simple: rice, grilled vegetables, lean meat. But the act became ritual, a way to fill the spaces that still resisted words. Sandra didn't ask him to stay in the kitchen. He didn't ask her to share more than she was ready to give. Yet, slowly, without declaration, their routines began to overlap until they no longer needed the excuse of performance to act like a married couple. Then, one evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Sandra placed a small box on the table between them. Evan raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "I ordered it a while ago," she said. "Wasn't sure if I'd give it to you." He opened the lid and found a ring. Plain, brushed silver, no stones, no flourish. "I know we didn't do rings before," she said. "Didn't seem necessary. Still doesn't. But I figured maybe it could mean something now." Evan didn't speak right away. He turned the ring over in his palm. It was cool, solid, heavier than it looked. "Do you want me to wear it?" he asked. "I want you to decide if it means anything to you." He slipped it onto his finger. It fit. "I guess it does," he said simply. She nodded, satisfied, and didn't say anything else. From then on, they began receiving fewer letters from strangers and more messages from people who had followed their story from the shadows. Not the curious, not the critics, but those who recognized pieces of themselves in Sandra's quiet defiance and Evan's unorthodox resilience. A woman who had been mocked for her body her entire life wrote to say she'd started lifting weights. A man in his 40s admitted he'd always thought he was too soft to be desirable, until he saw Evan stand proudly next to someone who could carry him if she had to. And Renee from Wisconsin wrote again. This time, she included a photo, her first weightlifting medal. Sandra posted it on the fridge without a word. There were no grand declarations, no sudden shift from married strangers to lovers in the moonlight. That was never who they were. What grew between them was slower, stronger, made of the kind of trust that doesn't need witness to be real. One afternoon, Evan came home early from class and found the house quiet. Too quiet. Sandra wasn't in the gym or the kitchen or in her study. He found her sitting on the floor of the storage room, surrounded by old photographs and music notebooks. She looked up when he entered, eyes softer than he'd ever seen them. "I thought I'd throw some of this away," she said, "but I don't think I want to." "You shouldn't," he said, crouching beside her. "It's not weakness to remember who you were." She smiled faintly. "You say that like you're older than me." "I feel it some days," he said, leaning against the wall. They spent the next hour sorting through her past, her competitions, her failed music dreams, letters from sponsors who disappeared when she stopped smiling for cameras. For the first time, she let him read some of her lyrics aloud. They weren't polished, but they were raw, beautiful in their honesty. "Why did you stop writing?" he asked. No one wanted to listen. "I do." She didn't reply, but that night, long after he had gone to bed, he heard the faintest hum drifting down the hallway. Off-key, quiet, but unmistakably hers. The seasons began to change. Leaves turned brittle. The wind grew sharper. Sandra pulled her heavier coats out of storage. Evan started layering hoodies under jackets. They had lived together nearly 8 months. The immigration paperwork had been approved without question. Noah came to follow up. The state was satisfied. But for Sandra and Evan, something deeper had settled, a feeling of permanence that no document could grant or take away. On a cold Sunday morning, Sandra returned from a run and found Evan in the backyard, painting a crude wooden bench he had built from salvaged lumber. He had never been particularly handy, but the effort was endearing. He looked up as she approached, wiping sweat from her brow. "Built it for the corner," he said, nodding toward the garden they'd begun planting 2 months ago. "You said you wanted a place to read." She studied the bench for a moment, then sat on it. It creaked ominously. She didn't move. "It's terrible," she said. "Yeah." She leaned back. "I love it." They sat together in the cold, hands tucked into sleeves, shoulders touching. "I never thought I'd want to stay anywhere," she said after a long while. "But this feels like staying." Evan nodded. "I didn't think I'd be wanted," he said quietly. "Not really. Not without pretending to be someone stronger, someone more impressive." "You don't need to impress me," she said. "I don't want to." She turned to him then, and for once there was no guarded distance between them, no performance, no transaction, just two people who had grown roots in soil neither of them trusted at first. When she kissed him, it was not the grand climax of a story. It was something quieter, a confirmation, a promise that didn't need to be spoken. They stayed outside until their fingers went numb. Inside the house, the old photograph of her teenage self still sat on the counter. Evan passed it on his way to make tea and paused. He looked at the smiling girl with a guitar on her back and the sea behind her. Then he looked toward the living room where Sandra was curled on the couch beneath a thick gray blanket, scrolling quietly through a new playlist he had made for her. Her body had changed. Her world had hardened. But the core of her, brave, fierce, uncertain, had remained intact. He placed the photo back down and smiled. Not everything had to be fixed to be whole, and sometimes the strongest homes were the ones built slowly, deliberately, not out of passion or obligation, but out of the quiet, defiant belief that they both deserved to belong, to each other, to themselves, and to a world that would never understand how something so strange, so unlikely, could become so beautifully real. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and check out our next video. There's always another story waiting.